Yeah, Ms. Gordon.
Ms. Gordon is up next?
I think Ms. Gordon's up next. Am I
Okay.
correct? I think I'm correct.
Well, I think he has one more after.
Yeah, one more.
One more after.
Okay.
Oh, is there two? Are there two?
No, just one sentence. Okay,
Yes.
What is it?
Thank you very much.
you guys get it?
Yes, oh.
Did you listen to it? Did you listen to the whole thing? Whole hour and a half?
Yeah, this was a longer one. And for those of you who said that you only listened to the beginning, the end ended up being a little bit more relevant to us. So I apologize for that. Maybe I should have put that in, listen backwards. I'm not sure how we would do that. But it was a long one. So for this, I was trying to decide among a bunch of different topics, especially at this point in the session where we're deep into the prepare it, as opposed to, so I'm picking the subjects that I think are of interest. This, unfortunately, just keeps coming up. Guns, they don't seem to be able to stay out of the news for too long. In the interim, since I sent you the email about how current it was, because it was current a week and a half ago or 2 weeks ago, so there was another shooting just in these last couple of days. Apparently, it could have been a lot worse than it was. They immediately went into the lockdown drills that we practice here all the time, and I think unfortunately these real-world reminders of how important they are important. Sorry?
He had a reputation, he killed his wife, he was shooting guns, they didn't do anything.
Yeah, the other one.
So the question somewhat on the table now is, well, what exactly could or should they have done? So this podcast I found interesting just because, first of all, in general, I like this series a lot. I find the Supreme Court endlessly interesting, and just I didn't know that much about the gun history, and it's just such a dominating portion of American society these days, and something that's pretty foreign to me. Like, guns are not a part of my life. I think that's a lot of us, just based on where we live geographically, religiously, socioeconomically, whatever it is. So just getting a little bit of a window into really what happened. This Heller decision is a huge piece of contemporary jurisprudence, and just you see how much of it is almost accident of history. Like this guy, he's a real nut, and they really come off as crazy because he's not your ideal plaintiff, and they knew that. They wanted nothing to do with this guy. They had lined up all the right plaintiffs with all the right stories, and because of this hyper-technical requirement of standing, they couldn't get anybody else into court, and just this guy fell into their lap as their public face, and it really changes the impression that the public gets. So just let's spend just a very little time on the constitutional and societal question of guns, and then we'll spend some time on the Jewish approach. That's what I want to do more. Most of that part is Rabbi Shlomo Brody. I don't know if you guys have encountered him. He used to go by Miles Brody. He lives in Israel now. He was in this area for a while. He's a young-ish rabbi who does a lot of contemporary halachic issues. He has a halacha column in the Jerusalem Post, so you might have seen him over there. So he's written a bunch of different variations on this article of gun control and halacha. Not too many other people are doing it, so he was my first stop in terms of putting together the sources on this. So really much of what we're going to discuss today is built on his back. Yeah?
Is it about you? His name started as Miles and it ended up as.
No. His father is a professor in Houston. He actually, in the previous go-around with YU, he was a candidate for president when they ended up hiring President Joel. So his father is an academic from Houston. He was in the papers for a while as a possibility, and now his son is making a name for himself. He teaches in a few of the Israeli yeshivas. He works with Tikva. I don't know if you're familiar with that. If he works with Tikva, that tells us that he should at least have an open mind for gun control. Tikva is a very conservative, lowercase c, politically conservative Jewish organization. So I think he has a very fair approach, and we'll spend some time on that.
But being from Texas, so he
And being
was
from Texas, I
around.
think he probably that definitely gives him a certain degree of built-in. In these days, who you are gives you license to discuss certain topics. So you're absolutely right. I think that gives him gravitas. So I will lean on his biography before we discuss this. It's interesting just because, as they keep pointing out, everything is built on the Second Amendment, which is such a legislative mess as a sentence, just grammatically. It's really difficult. It's really difficult to. For those of you who didn't listen, there was a great line somebody said. It was as if James Madison had just discovered the comma and said, "Ooh, this is fun," and just started putting it in almost at random. So a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. It's virtually unreadable, and just everything focuses on.
Why is it unreadable? I always thought it pretty readable.
Really? So what is it? So the big question is, when it says that the right cannot be shall not be infringed. So what's the subject of that?
Okay, suppose you don't have the first part of the militia. You have just the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed.
That's a great sentence.
Okay, that's fine.
Yes.
But because you have that preceding about the militia.
That's what gets us into trouble.
That adds a condition that would otherwise not be there. Somehow, the right of people to keep and bear arms is connected with. It's not in my mind. It wasn't just an individual right. It's somehow connected with.
Right. In which case, the word "people" seems almost mean, right? It seems. Why would he use the word "of the people" in the second clause if he's only talking about the militia? No, it almost seems like no matter which way you argue, the counter argument is going to be better, right? In other words, and if you wanted to argue the way that they came out, the way the conservatives came out in Heller, that there is an individual right to it in the people, so then the other side says, hey, wait a minute, what about that militia part at the beginning? So no matter which way you argue, I mean, this is very Talmudic, no matter which way you argue, the counter argument, I think, is going to be stronger. The problem is the sentence has to mean something. So it's very difficult to understand. The fact that this is societally such a divisive issue in the sense that it's really one of the areas where the country feels like different countries. We don't get it. Right, this appeal of guns, maybe some of us
I don't
do.
think.
I don't
think
get
it's
it.
gone beyond that. The guns aren't in so many minds of the people who support it. The guns aren't guns. They're a symbol of something that clearly is critical to the people who don't want any kind of limitations on the gun. No. I don't think it's that. I think
Well,
it's
we're
something
speaking like anthropologists, right? In other words, it's almost like we're looking at this
psychological,
other.
emotional.
We're looking at this other, and we're trying to figure it out. These are our countrymen, and yet, on this issue, I think more than almost any other, geographically, we're so far divided that it really is hard to understand. The other issue that I think, I always think of gun control and abortion as kind of mirror images in our society, in one very limited sense, which is that the proponents of each are so convinced that the other side is out to get everything, and they're probably right, that refuse to make even what would be, what to the outsider, common sense regulation or compromise, because they know that if I give in on the assault weapons, they're coming for that's just step one. And every time you give a finger, they're after the hand, the arm, and the torso next. And therefore it really leads each side to take positions that you look at them and you're like, oh my gosh, really? That's where you're against checks for mental health, right? Is that real? So I think on each side, and when I say this sometimes, people who are on each side say, no, that's true about the other side, but not about us. Okay, could be. But to me, that's where it feels most that the debate has gotten so heated, intense, and again, I think they're right. I think the other side really is after everything, and they don't feel like they can compromise at all, and that just leads us to tremendous gridlock, and basically, what does Justice Kennedy feel? Which is, I guess, maybe a step forward from what does Justice O'Connor feel today. Kennedy has a tendency to go, to the left, swing left on some issues, right on some issues. O'Connor was a little bit more, well, even with the same issue today, depending on the facts of a particular case, whatever, she was much, when she was the swing vote along with Kennedy, when it was 4 liberals, 3 conservatives, 2 middle people. So O'Connor was even less predictable. I think that's the general consensus of court watchers. It's not just that she was even less predictable than Kennedy was. And now we're seeing it. I mean, yeah. So I'm sorry. You wanted to say something?
I was going to say that you're comparing with the abortion and gun control. I think is very interesting because for the most part the proponents of each also don't have contact with each other. They're functioning in different worlds, and it's easier to demonize the other in that case, which is not always the case with controversial issues.
100%. I think that's very true, and also just the stakes are so high. So if you are on the anti-side of guns or abortion, you have the real self-righteousness, not in a negative way self-righteousness. You have the in your mind, this is life and death, and therefore how can I compromise on life and death? So you put all that together, and that I think really gets to as toxic a political climate as we can, because how can you compromise? So I'm not sure how those stories end, other than the Supreme Court. So, okay. What I want to talk more about, if there's not more on that, is a Torah approach, because this is one of those issues where you don't naturally think to yourself, oh, let's just open up to the parsha of gun control and learn that sugya and follow it through the Gemara to the Shulchan Aruch. And therefore, Rabbi Brody really did, I think, a real service of imaginatively, some are easier than others, some are harder than others, but putting together a Torah approach to gun control on the one hand. Therefore, I guess people can take issue with it more, but you guys all tell me what you think is compelling or not. So, number one, in this first section over here, where it just talks about weapons in Masorah, so he points out that it really is a mixed bag. The first time that we ever encounter weapons, it is not as an object of force or aggression, but as protection. Adam and Chava are exiled from Gan Eden, and it says that you had these kruvim, which is an interesting plant. The cherubs, which we don't see again until the Mishkan, when they sat on top of the Aron, and this encircling sword, blocking them again from Gan Eden. I don't think we could find that physically. The whole Parshas Bereshis is, but the point is, it does use the imagery of a sword, and it's there as protection rather than violence. Then you get to Cain and Hevel, and whereas it doesn't, there's no murder weapon specified when Cain kills his brother, but it's instructive that a couple of generations later, we have Cain's children being the creative ones. Not that they had that much competition at that point, right? Obviously Hevel is dead, but Cain's children and grandchildren creating, one of them created, Tuval Cain created these metal instruments, and Rashi points out that what kind of instruments, metal instruments were they using, was that he took the umnasos shel Cain, the trade of Cain, creating murder weapons, right? Klei Zayin, weapons, l'rotzchim, for murderers. This, for those of us who have studied before, I think last year we did Cain and Hevel more generally. I'm a Cain fan, or apologist as you see it, so this Rashi is not exactly headed in that direction, but there are other ways. Okay, and we know the famous pasuk from Yeshayahu, Lo yisa goy al goy charev, lo yilmedu od milchama, that in the messianic times we will get rid of all of these weapons, beat them into plowshares, and what we're seeing, I think, and then you see the keshet, the bow and arrow, is we see Yishmael uses it as a weapon, but then Hashem uses it as the symbol of peace with the weapon facing downward. Well, what we seem to get, at least symbolically, is this ambivalent approach to weaponry, which is, on the one hand, obviously, they are dangerous and violent. On the other hand, that they are sometimes necessary for protection and almost a necessary evil. And therefore, ultimately, when we're in idyllic messianic times, so then we'll be able to set all of our weaponry aside, but until we get there, that doesn't seem to be realistic just yet. Just other sources, we know that on the Mizbeach you can't use it, you can't use metal because that's used as a danger, that's used for weapons. It's an interesting halakha question that we're not going to get into now. The Gemara learns from there that you can't enter a Beit Midrash with weapons. And it seems to be paskined in the Shulchan Aruch that it only means exposed weapons. For years, this was not particularly relevant. These days, you walk around Israel, there are soldiers walking around all the time. And they're coming into the Beit Midrash, so there's a lot of contemporary discussion about how to do that, if it's possible to keep it covered. Some people say remove the ammunition while you can, but sometimes that's not a very good idea. So again, competing halachic interests, but the state of Israel resuscitates what had been hibernating halachic questions for a while. This Mishnah in Shabbos is interesting. It's talking about carrying on Shabbos. If there's no Erev, you're not permitted to carry on Shabbos, but you are permitted to go out. If something, like you can wear a necklace, that's not called carrying, even though it's not covering your body, it's not clothing, but because it's an adornment, an accessory, so that's considered clothing. So what about, it says you can't go out with a sword, a bow, a shield, any of these types of weapons, and Rabbi Eliezer says no, people used to wear those not just to use, in which case that would be carrying for sure. People would use that was a sign of honor, of dignity. They would go out in their suit with their weapons. That showed that they were important people. So Rabbi Eliezer says that you can wear them on Shabbos. They are tachshitin, they're men's jewelry. And the Chachamim say, no, ain't an elul lignai. How could you say that is adorning you, that is accessorizing? That's embarrassing. Gnai, this is a disgrace.
That's a
So they say-
sexist comment.
That's a
Sexist comment.
Why?
It's only men's jewelry. It could be women's jewelry also.
dafka. There's a it might be sexist, but halacha l'maaseh, there is traditionally, again, the modern state of Israel brings up questions that have been generally, we say that beged isha or beged ish is not just about clothing, and therefore there are sources that a man is not allowed to look in the mirror or a man is not allowed to color his hair because that's considered beged isha. Now, obviously, some element of that is going to be societal. It's clear that 60 years ago, a woman wearing pants was considered beged ish. Bisman hazeh, clearly, it's not. At what point in those 60 years did it flip from yes to no? Does it change depending on where you live? Which society are we taking the pulse of? Is it the broader American society? Is it the Jewish society? Is it the Orthodox Jewish? Is it my Orthodox Jewish? These are hard questions. But carrying a weapon was considered beged ish, and therefore women, there was a default historical halachic problem with women carrying weaponry. Obviously, if it's for self-defense, then generally that's a halachic value that carries the day over many other halachic values. Bisman hazeh with women in the army, so there's been a reevaluation of that, and it doesn't seem that hard to get around, right? In other words, you have a pink whatever, so beged ish, beged isha are not usually insurmountable halachic problems. But yeah, is it sexist? Perhaps, but it's not my fault. I guess maybe it's my fault for bringing it up. But it's okay.
It just wasn't at that time.
Yeah, for sure. Good. Probably the best known source on all of these issues is a tshuva from the Noda B'Yehuda that a lot of people like to quote in different contexts, and it's worth doing a little bit inside. He got a question. What about, is it okay for Jews to hunt? Is it okay for Jews to hunt? And so we're on source Yudalid over here on the third page. So I want to do it a little bit inside just because it's worth saying. So he says, Shorish elato ish echad asher zacheu Hashem b'nachala rachava. Right? God graced him with lots of land. V'yesh lo kfarim v'ya'arot. He has like almost villages within his land, but he has forests. And asher v'ya'arot tirmos kol chayso ya'ar. They have all kinds of jungle animals. Imutarlo leilech ba'atzmo lirot b'kanas reifa latzud sayid. Is he allowed to go hunting on his lands? Oh, imasur liyisrael lasot davar zeh im mishum tzar ba'achayim im mishum bal tashrit. Is it prohibited for a Jew? And the asker of the question suggested two possible reasons why it might be prohibited. Number one would be bal tashrit, right? That you can't destroy needlessly things that are otherwise productive, or potentially tzar ba'alei chayim, that we don't cause harm to living beings, again, with no particular reason. So he says that your two halach issues are not really such an issue. And Cain, we skipped a lot. He says tzar ba'alei chayim is not an issue because the animals wouldn't suffer. You would be killing the animals. We kill animals for human need all the time, right? We do it for food, for clothing. The Torah does not, that's not called tzar ba'alei chayim. Do it in a humane way. So hunt in a humane way. Tzar ba'alei chayim, he says, is not an issue. He says, mishum bal tashchit v'aday leka. It's not an issue of bal tashchit either. Harei nene be'or. Right? Even though if you're hunting, so that you're not going to be able to eat the meat, or it might not even be a kosher animal, but you're getting benefit from the skins or from the furs that you're getting, so that's not called bal tashchit. You're killing them for a productive use. And you're not doing it in a destructive manner, so therefore it's not a problem. Until now we've been talking about technical letter of the law. I'm stunned, right? It's a wonder, tmiah, by the question to begin with. If you look through Tanakh and Torah Sheba'al Peh, who are the hunters that we know of? So this week's parish we see Esav, Nimrod, both characters who in Pshat are ambiguous, but in Torah Sheba'al Peh are definitely viewed negatively. That's not what we do. בלי שום צורך, רק לגמורכם דת זמנו להתעסק בצידה. How is it possible that a Jewish person would kill a living creature actively, biyadayim, just for no real reason, just to engage in hunting? It says, Mi shehu ish hatzarich lazev farnasato mitzeda. If you need it as a job, he says, okay, fine, kazu bezel lo shayach achzorius. That's not cruelty. Bari shochtem behemot v'chayet v'ofot v'mitim dagim v'tzorach adam. Umali tahorim sheyochim b'sar mali tmeim v'yeshayochel v'yafranis atzmo midmei orosehen v'chol bali chayim nitnu l'adam l'chol tzarcha. He says, if you're doing it because that's your profession, you are a hunter, that's how you feed your family, so that's no different than being a shochet. It doesn't matter if you're doing it. So eating animals is no greater a profession than hunting for skins, or if you're doing it, that's how you're making a living. He says, I can respect that. We're okay with sacrificing animal life for human life. But this is the most famous part. If you don't need it for your parnasa, for your living, if you're not doing it for the parnasa, so then that is cruelty. Until now, I'm just talking about what is correct, what's right, that you have to keep away. Now, getting back to the letter of the law, you mentioned Tzar Chaim, you mentioned Baal Tashka. He says that's not the real halachic problem. I think it's not safe, right? We're confident that we're going to get the animal. The animal's not just going to sit there; they're going to come after us also, right? We know from Dick Cheney that you often have accidents when it comes to hunting. You're after one, and you mishit someone else. I mean, that's what happened with Cain, right? Cain, according to Torah Shabbat, according to the Midrash, Cain was killed when his great grandson was hunting and accidentally killed Cain. These things happen. So he says, even aside, and I guess the Noda B'Yehuda would be a northerner in contemporary U.S. It's like, I don't, forgetting everything else. It's cruelty. It's not what we do. And you're putting yourself at risk for no reason. This is off the table, he says. Again, halachic considerations, you can make your case. But sometimes, and this is an issue that comes up a lot, Bisman Hazeh, right? To what extent do extra halachic messages enter into halachic conversations? This is on the front lines of many of the contemporary issues that our community is dealing with. And what the Noda B'Yehuda seems to be saying over here is that once you go through the halachic sources and there's nothing that says this is prohibited, you're not done with your analysis yet. There still are these other seemingly extra halachic considerations that we take into account. Fine. So he points out over here that our job is to be careful to protect our lives. Right? We have an obligation. We don't consider our lives to be ourselves. It's prohibited. Suicide is prohibited by the Torah. Harming yourself is prohibited by the Torah. We are not considered to have autonomous ownership over our lives. I think a better model would be what we hope is a long-term lease. And therefore, we have this obligation to protect. Actually, I'm not sure exactly where it's going to go, but we know that there's. My son just started Gemara, so they like to start them in Masechet Bava Metzia. Traditionally, a lot of people start over there, and a lot of the young kids learn about the rules of. I'm missing Pikadon, Hamafkid, right? So it's basically what it is that's when you have a split between ownership and possession. So that can happen in lots of different ways. It can happen that the person who owns an item is not the one who's currently holding it. So there are all kinds of rules. I make my students memorize them, but it's much easier to just absorb and understand rather than memorize. But in other words, let's say I borrow something, so then the owner is doing me a favor, and therefore I'm going to have a high degree of liability in case something goes wrong, even if it's not my fault to get struck by lightning. It's not my fault, but since he was the one who was doing me a favor, so therefore I'm going to be liable. On the other hand, on the other extreme, if someone's doing me a favor and watching, can you keep an eye on this while I go do whatever it is? So then the arrow of benefit is lopsided in the other direction, though, unless they really, really mess up. So they're not going to be held liable when something goes wrong. In between, you have arm's length transactions. If someone rents an item, or if they pay someone to watch it, a dog kennel, or I rent a car, and no one's doing anybody else a favor. They're just, I'm giving you money, you're performing a service for me, so then there's that intermediate level of responsibility. So I wonder, I'm still not sure exactly how much this works, if there's something that we can learn from that in terms of our relationship with Hashem, right? If we say, as we just did, that Hashem is giving us our lives as this, Hashem remains the owner of my body, my soul, whatever it is, and I'm just watching it for Him. So perhaps also we can use this idea.
Alexa Lukinov, you have something in the office, Alexa.
If I go through my life as a shoel, meaning I take all the benefit, but I don't give anything back, I'm a borrower, so Hashem is really doing me the favor, then perhaps I'm going to have that much more culpability when something goes wrong, and I'm not careful in terms of my mitzvah observance. On the other hand, to whatever extent I give back more than I benefit from in this world, then maybe it would shift and I would have less responsibility. What's interesting is, what I find interesting, is that there's one exception to all these rules, where you have this, even a borrower would have this get out of jail free card, where you wouldn't be liable, what's called ba'alav imo, that if something goes wrong, but the owner is there with you at the time of the damage when it happens, so then you're going to be off the hook even if you were taken, which I think might be, we all try to live God-centric lives. If we live a life of ba'alav imo, where the owner is always with us, maybe that's this kind of get out of jail, whatever it would be, free to, on the other hand, to whatever extent we're living that kind of life, we're also more likely to avoid these mishaps. To begin with, I'm not 100% sure exactly where all this is going, but there seems to be something there, or maybe not. You can decide on that. In any event, we are commanded to take care of ourselves, right? I remember when the olive wood factory in Israel was a big thing. I don't think it's as popular these days, but it used to be very, very popular. So one of the most popular items back when I was a kid, they used to sell ashtrays that said in them, they would write, Ushmartem ma'od l'nafshotech, right? You should guard your life very seriously. At the time, people still thought smoking was funny. These days, I'm not sure, I doubt they make it because it's not such a laughing matter anymore. But we are commanded to do that, sometimes in general ways. Yishamer lecha u'shmor nafshecha ma'od. That is, in its simplest reading, that pasuk is referring to guarding our neshamot, right, from learning bad things from the nations around us. But there are psukim that talk about guarding our bodies. There's a commandment that you can't have a roof without a gate on top, right? That's things that you would expect to find from your local regulatory agency. The Torah is giving significant religious value to. And then what you find is, and this is an area that I found interesting that Rabbi Brody went, he says there are rules about dangerous animals. This triggered for me, I remember when I was studying for the bar, in American law, I don't know if it's in all states or if it's just in New York, it's the only bar I took, there's a rule of strict liability. Very few things have strict liability attached to them, meaning that we're going to hold you liable for damage, even if it's totally not your fault. Strict liability means it doesn't matter how much you try to protect things. Usually, if let's say if I have a pool, I was listening to a different podcast that I didn't share with you guys, but I can afterwards if you want. Freakonomics on gun control, and they were saying that per pool versus gun, a pool is much more dangerous to have in your house than a gun. That seemed a little bit misleading because there's so many more guns than there are pools. So just saying on a per item basis, I'm not sure that that's so fair, but that's what he was saying. And people don't say, I would never send my kid to that one's house because they have a pool, but they do say that about guns. So whatever it is, I think that was an interesting comparison. But in general, if someone has a pool and they put up a fence and somehow, God forbid, a kid gets through all the defenses, so you're not going to be held liable for the damage that was done if you took the proper precautions. There are very few areas in American law where they say no, even if you took all the proper precautions, this is objectively dangerous and you're on the hook. And one of them is dangerous animals. And it has a list of animals that, look, you want to do it, that's up to you, but you're on your own. And therefore we're going to impose strict liability. You are on the hook for any damage that it does. So the Mishnah seems to be, the Gemara seems to be doing this also. It says, don't take a bad dog into your house, right? And then it gives other animals that it says, the Torah, especially in Torah Sheba'al Peh, has a very, very negative attitude towards dogs. They weren't, I think Rav Soloveitchik once said that, how do you know, this is not my favorite of all his quotes, but he says, how do you know that our Jewish community has become so assimilated that we're not even afraid of dogs anymore? He was like stunned. How could it be that a Jew is not afraid of a dog? So it says you can't have a bad dog, and I'm not sure why the sources are exactly in this order. Let's get back to dogs in a second. I think fine. So it says you can't have a bad dog. You can't have these things that are likely to cause accidents in your house. You have to put gates on. You can't have an open pit or an open well. You need to protect those items. Anything that's likely to cause an accident, you can't house. This Rabbi Bleich letter is interesting. He wrote this as an open letter to John Hinckley. John Hinckley, I think many of you will remember. John Hinckley is the guy who shot Ronald Reagan as a sign of his affection for Jodie Foster. He's the kind of gentleman who these days we would be trying to keep guns away from. Rabbi Bleich wrote an open letter to the pawn shop owner who sold Hinckley his gun, happened to be Jewish. So Rabbi Bleich wrote an open letter to this broker. Now, he says, in general, while gun control is not an issue that the Torah deals with directly, we do have a rule of that you can't put a stumbling block in front of a blind person. And he says, these guns are the ultimate stumbling blocks. And the mentally ill are the blind people who clearly you're loading and locking these weapons and putting them in the hands of people who aren't able to stop themselves. It says Jewish law recognizes the indiscriminate sale of weapons cannot fail to endanger the public. Right? That is lifnei ivra. Now, a detail of lifnei ivra, generally we say, is that it has to be what we call trei ivrei denahara. You're not going to be liable for violating, encouraging, or aiding and abetting someone in committing a crime, in violating an aveira, unless, but for your help, they could not have done this crime. So if I give someone a McDonald's, if I give someone a Big Mac, so generally we think that would be lifnei ivra o titin l'shol. If they had $1 in their pocket, they could have just as easily gone in and bought their own Big Mac. That's not technically going to be it would probably be a violation of the midrabanan of what's called misayel dvar avera, right? Aiding and abetting the commission of an avera. And over here, whether it's an avera that is like eating a Big Mac only affects the person, or it's an avera that affects other people, like potentially selling them guns, shouldn't matter necessarily, and lifnei iver would be in force. On the other hand, the ease in which people can acquire guns would imply that it probably isn't a technical lifnei iver. What's interesting over here is, and he gets into selling guns. This is a big issue in terms of the modern state of Israel, because they do sell very controversially to all kinds of not great people. We're a little bit running out of time, so I'll just make a couple of points. Rabbi Brody makes the point that when it comes to these dangerous dogs, if you go through the evolution of the halacha, so you have all kinds, you see them grappling with it. And on the one hand, they recognize that they're dangerous to innocent people on the inside or guests, but on the other hand, they're also valuable as protection against non-friends. And I mean, our history is riddled with people, with times when we needed that kind of protection, and they really struggle with it. And sometimes they'll say, no, you can't have it, and other people say, well, you know what, if you live on the border, so then you can have it because you're much more at risk, but you have to keep it chained up. But maybe at night, you don't want to keep it chained up because you want it to be able to go where the risk is. So they say, well, you have to keep it chained during the day. And other people will say, no, even at night you have to keep it chained up because what about the internal risk to the people who you like? And then someone says, well, maybe you can only have one dog. And then they say, but if you have a lot of property, then maybe you need more than one dog. And what he points out, and I give you this paragraph all the way at the end, he says, if you obviously guns are different than dogs in a lot of ways. Number one, the damage that you can do is much worse. Number two, it's much easier to train a gun, right? When we say guns, guns don't kill people, people kill people. And in actuality, both people and guns, of course, kill people. But dogs are harder to control, but also can do less damage. In any event, though, the comparison is instructive. You just substitute the word gun for the word dog, and this back and forth, you see the struggle, and his conclusion is, and I think it makes a lot of sense, good intentioned, smart, educated people can reach opposite sides. And on the one hand, there is this idea of guns are incredibly dangerous. On the other hand, we can understand why it's in the Constitution, right? When you're trying to take over the other population, the first thing you're going to do is go after their weapons so that they can't fight back. So often when you see fire in the Torah, or when you see, this is one of my father's favorite divrei Torah, he likes to quote, good fire, bad fire. Usually, is fire good or is fire bad? So the answer is neither. Fire is powerful, right? Fire can either be a great force for good, but without fire we couldn't live, we couldn't cook, we couldn't have heat. On the other hand, it can be tremendously destructive. That's usually the symbolism, right? When you see the matbea shel ish, right, that there was a coin made out of fire, what's the symbolism there? So lots of different things. One of them is that money is powerful. It can be powerful in a good constructive way. It can be powerful in a tremendously destructive way. Is the internet good or bad? Yes, right? So it just means, so once again, are guns good or are guns bad? So yes, they are potentially good, they are potentially bad, and therefore we need to, as even Heller said, Heller didn't just say there's a Second Amendment right to own a gun and therefore have fun. The fact, just like we have the First Amendment and we have free speech, but there are regulations on it, so too, and I don't know, at the end of the podcast they left that as like this tragic ending, that there's a right to guns, but they get to regulate it, and now what are we supposed to do? I don't know, to me that seems like a pretty good ending, right? You have a right to guns, and now go regulate it in a legal, sane way, and it's hard to regulate. Great. So do the hard work of regulating it. He says, within the Torah approach, it's very hard when you say the Torah supports my position on X, Y, Z. So always take it with a grain of salt. Often what you'll find is that you really have competing interests, and the Torah position is going to recognize that, and we have to do the hard, complicated work of trying to get as much good as we can without the risks and dangers. Okay, Yasher Koach. The extra week in between hopefully will be good for me, that I'll be able to get it to you with enough time, even if I don't get it out before the weekend Shabbaton start right now. But thank you for coming, and I'm looking forward to seeing you. Happy Thanksgiving. Looking forward to one more.